After Korach's rebellion is quelled, Hashem wants to consolidate the importance of the Kohanim, tells the nation that they have to give certain gifts to the Kohanim. The question is, why does the Torah then also include gifts to the Leviim? The rebellion was not against the Leviim. Once we explore that and the connection to the time of year, that it always coincides with Gimel Tammuz, and the nature of what happened on Gimel Tammuz, we'll come to appreciate that there are three different levels of how we connect our material possessions and ourselves to Hashem. So wegen des Smiches HaParshas, the fact that the Parshas are put together, on Shaychas von Abanihin and Osati L'chos Mishmeres Trumoisai L'chol B'nei Yisov V'Gomer, the pasuk that says that Hashem guarantees the Kohanim that they will have the Trumois, the various 24 gifts that are given to the Kohanim, the Inyan for Matnois Kehuna. The fact that that is placed right next to Tzemachloikas Korach, the rebellion of Korach, was steht for them in the Parsha, which is of course the bulk of what is discussed prior to that in the Parsha. Why are the two of them side by side? Zok the Sifri, and Rashi brings the Sarab, the Sifri teaches, and Rashi quotes it, as nachdem v'bo Korach v'ira ala kahuna, because Korach contested the kahuna. Hat der Eibusher gesagt, the Eibusher says, let's consolidate the kahuna. As the kahuna von Aaron is a kosev u'mayla bar kohen, that the Eibusher is going to completely consolidate, sign and seal, and ratify the value of the Kohanim. And the way we do that is by saying that the community has to give certain gifts to the Kohanim. Question is, darf man verstehen, das ist ein Teil auf der Hemshech Vashaychus von der Matnis Kehuna zu Machlokas Korach. That explains why the Torah would detail the 24 gifts to the Kohanim straight after Korach's rebellion against the Kohanim. But the question is, was ist aber die Shaychus von ihnen am Meiser, was mir gibt zum Levi? What would the connection then be between Meiser, which is the 10% we give to Leviim, as the pasuk says, that they're given the Meiser in lieu of the fact that they also serve in the Mishkan and subsequently in the Beis HaMikdash. Was steht bald noch und in derselbe Amira von ani chelkecha? How come that is stated straight after, and in fact in the same statement of giving the gifts to the Kohanim, to quote the Targum Onkelos, Matan de Yehavaslan inun chulkach, that your portion is these gifts that you are given, Matnos Kehuna. So how does it link? So Machlokas Korach, what has that to do with Machlokas of Korach? Korach fought against Kehuna. It makes sense that the Eibusher says, let's give the Kohanim special gifts to consolidate the position. Korach was a Levi. He wasn't fighting against the Leviim. Why do we discuss Meiser in the same conversation? Nachmer, let's take that question a step further. Not only does Meiser and the position of the Leviim not really relate to Korach's rebellion, it's actually the opposite of Korach's rebellion, because Machlokas Korach is given nor ala kehuna. The only issue Korach had was against the kehuna. Or bikashtem gam kehuna, as Moshe Rabbeinu says to Korach, you also want the kehuna? Or nitayf Levia, he wasn't arguing against the position of the Leviim. Why not? Because he was a Levi, and not only any ordinary Levi, he was a senior member of the Levi community. Ben Yitzhar ben Kahos. So he didn't have an issue with being a Levi. Why consolidate the position of the Levi after his machlekas? Okay, you might want to answer, well, it's because the harsh response to Korach may have weakened the position of the Levi, and the Torah has to reconstitute it. That's exactly why we're talking about Levim at this point. Korach is given von Shevet Levi, because Korach was a Levi. Und die Machlekes ist gekommen von ihm und noch andere von Shevet Levi. And he was the one, together with other members of his Shevet, driving this argument against Moshe and Aaron. Das Gufa, was ist eine given Bnei Levi, is given die Sibbe von Zertaine Machlekes. So what prompted them to contest the Kohuna? The fact that they were Leviim. Wie Moshe hat es gesagt. Listen to what Moshe said to them. You can hear in it that the fact that they were Leviim was what precipitated their argument. Shimona b'nei Levi. He says to them, listen, you are the children of Levi. Is it not good enough that David just separated you from the rest of the nation to serve? You have a position. And David brought you and all of your comrades close. Now you want more than that to also be Kohanim? So because they came at this fight from a position of being Leviim, when they lost, when they were proven wrong, you might think that the result is some diminution of the value of and role of the Levi. Der Rebbe hat Eibishter zusammen mit dem Zivei Matnis Kehuna, which would then explain that while the Eibishter introduces the gifts for the Kohanim, which consolidate the Kohanim's position, at the same time, he reconsolidated the Levium's position by saying there's also gifts for them, which would help us relax and accept that the Levium retain their special position in the community. Maybe that's why the Meiser is included over here. Problem is, it's actually a difficult explanation to offer. Weil, von dem, was die Torah sagt, der Minion von Meiser ist behemshach zu Matnis Kohuna. If it had stood independently, if the Torah told us the gifts to the Kohanim, that shows us the Kohanim's position, and then independently told us the Meiser to the Levi, and that would consolidate the Levi's position, great. But that's not how it works. It's one hemshach. It's one conversation. Not only that, und dazu noch mit ham Vav hamoisif, velivnei Levi. It's like a continuation of the sentence. It starts with an and. Is mashma, that gives the impression that the connection between giving Maisa to the Levium and the rebellion of Korach is in demselben Eufen v'toichen wie die Sheiches von Matnis Gehuna zu Machlokas Korach, is along the same lines and on the same theme as whatever the gifts to the Kohanim will consolidate in clarifying or debunking Korach's rebellion. So how is this part of the same? How's it part of the same issue? In other words, just as the Matnos Kahuna are there to announce and publicize the great position of the Kohanim, the instruction you have to give Meiser must be to publicize the greatness of the Levium, not just to say they don't lose their greatness. Another thing. Considering we know that everything in Torah is absolutely precise, we have no option but to conclude as the Sheiches from Matne Kohuna Levia to Machlekas Korach, the fact that where does the Torah tell us about the gifts both to Kohanim and to Levium is straight after the rebellion of Korach, is not an open klali. That's not just a generic message. As Matnis Kohuna is a siman stam veraya as zu mechazik sein kunasar noch in error. We need something to endorse the Kohanim's position after this challenge against them. So we'll just generally use something called the gifts in order to endorse the position. It's deeper than that. Now, as the inhalt von Matnis Kehuna Levia hat Sheiches Machlokas Korach, whatever the message and theme and content of these gifts, both to the Kohanim and the Levium, is all about, that actually helps us to negate Korach's argument. So we've got to work out what about them. In order to understand that, let's go to something we already know from other places in Chassidus, what Korach was all about, what drove Korach's rebellion. Shankeret Amol Barucha, the Rebbe discussed this previously in a different Sikh in Chelek Ches, that in dem was es steht in Noam Elimelech, that the Noam Elimelech points out an interesting thing about Korach's rebellion. As the Inyan from Korach, what is Korach all about? So when it says Vayikach Korach, that Korach took all these people to rebel against Moshe, was der Targum Taich Vispala Korach. So the Targum Onkelos explains that Vayikach actually means he caused a split, he caused a division. That says the Noam Elimelech is al derech v'derikei amavdu b'mayim lemoim. That directly relates to the split that happened on the second day of creation between the higher and lower waters. Obteilen and obscheiden zwischen elyonim und tachtonim, which means for us the separation between a higher spiritual reality and a lower tactile reality. On in them is Bashanan Zamachlekas of Kohunas Aaron. That split, that division, which Korach identified as being part of the creative process, is what drove him to say we've got to do things differently. Why? Korach looks at it like this. A kohen is somebody who's completely separated from worldly matters. He doesn't own a job, he doesn't hold down a job, he doesn't get a salary. He's completely dedicated to spiritual things. Like the pasuk says, that David just separated Aaron and his family to be the holiest of the holy. That's all Kohanim. And then you have Aaron, who is the highest of all the Kohanim. He's not even allowed to leave the precinct of the Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, is Ma'adur Tisnasa Al Hashem. So that's what precipitated Korach's rebellion. So why are you elevating yourself over the Jewish people? In other words, what he's saying is, Why are you leading us? You should be in your orbit, in your spiritual realm, and you shouldn't be guiding and engaging with us. You should be aloof from us. You should be separated from us. Why then are you encroaching, in a sense, on the normal activity of the ordinary citizens to want us also to kind of step up and away from the world, elevate ourselves out of the material space? Is to vernehmen sich mit Dvarim Gashmim und machen sie kelim Chelekos. Our job is to engage the material world. Our job is to transform the material world into channels of holiness. So why is the Kohen, whose world is not engaged in this world, somebody who aligns with and influences the ordinary people who are engaged in this world? Und der Rebbe sagt, Taina madutis nasal kal Hashem, nicht in Stirut zu dem, was allein haben gewollt sein Kohanim. And that's why, at face value, it seems like they're contradicting themselves. Why are the Kohanim elevated? We want to be a Kohen. Well, make up your mind. Do you want the Kohanim to be a level playing field, like some socialist setup with everybody being equal? Or do you actually want to be a Kohen? Well, that's the point. Weil Korach hat gewollt als ein anderes Zug von Kohuna. Korach wanted to be a Kohen, but a different kind of a Kohen. He wanted to be a Kohen in the extreme. A Kohen who's completely cut off from the ordinary activities of the ordinary citizens and not to have any influence over them. And that's not something that's unique to Korach. We actually see that there were people who did exactly that in a small degree through the course of our history. As Shammai, look at Shammai. Shammai was a person who obviously had his focus correct, was completely dedicated to Hashem, but mitzad kapdonosai, because he had such a specific way of doing things, the person who came and said, teach me the whole Torah as I stand here on one foot, he pushed him out with a ruler, a building measure, because he wanted to say everything is measured. You don't just walk in over here and say, teach me everything, and you should be able to relate to me and my issues. And practically, if there's a debate between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, if we would go in favor of Beis Shammai, typically that would not be considered a valid Mishnah. Why? Because their way was so precise and so measured, and not everybody's at that level. Korach wants that kind of spirituality, but even more extreme, just totally removed from the ordinary experience of ordinary people and fixated on this high-level spiritual focus that is divorced from physical engagement. Another example. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his colleagues, who were in a very unique category of spirituality. The Gemara tells us that many people try to emulate the methodology of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which is total divorce from the physical world, only obsessed by Torah learning, and Hashem will care for you. And it didn't work for most people. And Rabbi Elazar, sein Sohn v'chaverov, is afil noch in 13. Jahr b'moreh is havamache. And even Rabbi Elazar, who was, of course, in that inner circle, after 13 years in the cave, firstly experiencing the deepest spiritual connection and then trying to regulate that and bring it back into the world, couldn't regulate. He needed Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai to kind of pick up the pieces wherever he caused some kind of negativity, because he couldn't tolerate people engaged in this world. Korach is like that to an extreme. Can't tolerate this engagement in the world. If you want to be a Kohen, you've got to be completely excised from all materialism. With that in mind, understanding what Korach wanted to achieve, this complete split and divorce between those majority of the people who engage with the physical world and try and use that as a conduit for godliness, versus the unique category that Korach wants to be, the extreme Kohen, who's totally divorced from the spiritual world. The response to Korach is gifts to the Kohen. Why? The first thing that the gifts of Kohanim teach us is that there has to be a relationship and connection between ordinary folk and the Kohanim. As Eden given their Eigentum zu die Kohanim. How is that connection made? Ordinary folk give their assets to the Kohanim. So the Kohanim are people who are removed from the world, they're removed from society, they live in a spiritual bubble, and we're the ones who provide for them. Das heißt, as a Heuben of their Gashmistik in Yonim, Zever Matnis Kohuna, which means we take ordinary physical things and we elevate and transform them so that they become gifts to those Kohanim who are living at a spiritual altitude beyond us. Not only is that considered a gift to the Kohen, but the Torah attests to the fact that when we give those gifts to the Kohanim, we're actually giving gifts to Hashem. So that's the response to Korach. Don't create this chasm, the higher and lower worlds, Vespale Korach, the split between the deeply spiritual, high-level individuals and the ordinary citizens. To the contrary, let the ordinary citizens link with those people, link with the Kohanim, and use that as a method of taking their materialism and elevating it to become holy. But das ist aber l'chera nit maspik. That's a wonderful explanation, but doesn't yet give us the full picture. Because we know very well that Korach aimed his attack against generally the concept of the Kohanim and specifically Aaron as the Kohen Gadol. Sein Kavone vegede b'chihuna dabei is doch aber gewen as soll sein Ashaychas nor beifen de Havdalah. So what did Korach want? Any connection between Kohanim and the citizens should be completely remote, distant, and aloof. Aber es soll nicht sein kein Chibur von Tachtenim von Welt mit Elyonim Kedusha Velikus. Korach did not want to have this link, this bond between the material world and holiness. At besten dass Chirge darf sein der Tikkun in an Eifen, als die Nyonim von Welt sollen den ganzen weggeben werden zum Eibestehen. So hang on a second. Korach wants complete separation between the holy and the mundane. Surely the response to him should be complete elevation of all mundane things. There should be a complete link between the higher and lower realms, the Kohen and my stuff. My stuff should become completely holy. Wie Korban is a great example of that would be a Korban. You take an animal, you turn it into a Korban, the entire animal becomes holy. That's not what happens with the gifts to the Kohanim. Aber nicht matnes kuna bichlal, wo seinen Achilas hanoas hakehanim, und kama mehem seinen chulin. What happens when you give gifts to the Kohanim is they use it for personal use. And some of them are in the category of chulin. They don't have any holiness attached to them. So how do we respond to Korach's great issue that there needs to be this massive separation between the intensely spiritual members of the community and the ordinary members of the community? By telling him, well, we'll give a little bit of an attachment. Surely the message should be, no, the whole chap is you take the physical world and you elevate it all to holiness. Doesn't seem to be happening in the gifts to the Kohanim. Before we can get there, we're going to cross-reference the story of Korach to the story of what happened on Gimel Tammuz, which always falls at this time. We'll have a similar question about Gimel Tammuz. Obviously not the same, but a similar question. Parashas Korach learned in Bechamim Shonim in Devoch from Gimel Tammuz. Typically we read Parashas Korach in the week of Gimel Tammuz, or the V'haintikim Yor in Dem Tog Gufa, or the year that this Sikha was said, it was actually on Gimel Tammuz itself that you read Parashas Korach. The Tog was der Rebbe des Shveris by Freit geworden von Tfisa in Yor Tov Pei Zayin, the day that the Frierdiker Rebbe was released from actual prison in 1927. At that time into house arrest and exile in Kostroma. Of course we know everything is divinely coordinated. Especially when the Shalah tells us that whatever special dates are on the calendar are always related to the parasha that we read at or around about that time. So there's got to be a link between what Gimel Tammuz represents and what the message of Parashas Korach is. So now that we've examined what was going on in Korach's world, he wanted to split the higher spiritual realms from the physical, normal, mundane activities. That will give us insight into the story of Gimel Tammuz. What is that? As we've mentioned, Korach did not have a problem with the principle of having Kohanim in the society. And he had no problem with the fact that those Kohanim will be removed from normal, daily, mundane activities. What Korach did have an issue with is, why are these Kohanim the people who are feeding influence and inspiration to the nation? The nation should be doing their own thing, and the Kohanim should be doing their own thing. The Frierdiker Rebbe had a similar experience from those people who opposed him and sought to give him all kinds of trouble and pass him on to the authorities, etc. Was hat sie gestellt? What bothered those people? Which caused them to arrest the Rebbe, bearing in mind that unfortunately they included Jewish people as well. It didn't bother them if the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted to be a Kohen in his own little space, doing his own spiritual things to the deepest degree that he wanted to. That didn't bother them. The fact that he wanted to spread Torah right across the entire Soviet Union, to touch all of the Jews in that country, that's what bothered them. You want to be a Kohen, be a Kohen. But you should have authority over the average person. You should have influence over the average person. That bothered them in exactly the way as Korach was bothered by the Kohanim having an influence over the community. So therefore, once they freed the Frierdiker Rebbe on the 3rd of Tammuz, that indicated as Deibishter had beweisen in Golile in Kol that Deibishter wanted to make a public statement as a Kemamshich sein in sein Arbeit von Abotzes HaTorah, that the Frierdiker Rebbe has a green light to continue what he's doing to spread Torah throughout the Soviet Union. Was in a very similar way to how did the Eibishter cancel or negate Korach's rebellion or arguments? By making a public ratification of the Kohen's position by saying here are the gifts to the Kohanim. So there's a clear link between Korach's rebellion and the Yevsekzia at the time, and the quelling of that rebellion and Gimel Tammuz. Only problem is, it doesn't actually seem to be exactly the same. Why? Because Gimel Tammuz is noch nicht given the full Befreiung von Rebbe. Unlike the end of the Korach story, when the Korach story ended, it ended. But Gimel Tammuz wasn't the end of the story for the Frierdiker Rebbe. It was only a release from the specific prison. But the story at that point was he was still going into exile in a faraway place in Kastrama. And in Kastrama he wouldn't be able to do his ordinary work of spreading Torah. So it doesn't feel like the story has ended. It doesn't feel like the rebellion has been overcome. That it was only going to happen later, 10 days later. And even after Yud Beis Gimel Tammuz, the Frierdiker Rebbe still had challenges until eventually he was able to leave Russia. So how do we compare the story where Korach's rebellion is completely eradicated with the Frierdiker Rebbe's so-called release at the time of Gimel Tammuz, which doesn't feel like a release? So we're going to have to explain as the Ähnlichkeit von der Gille von Rebbe mit den Ihnen von Köse v'Chesem l'chol Male bar Kohen Kehunas Aaron. So we're going to have to say that the link between the Frierdiker Rebbe's endorsement by Hashem, by virtue of the fact that he's redeemed from prison, is similar to Hashem's endorsement of the Kohanim through the Matnos Kehuna, is verbunden mit dem Teil von der Gule, wie ist noch given a kolponim bechitzonius in der Agbolus von Golus, bei die was haben ihm arrestiert. Fascinatingly, we're going to identify that the link to the greatness and the tremendous value of Hashem endorsing his position is actually reflected in Gimel Tammuz, maybe in a sense even more than on Yud Beis Tammuz. Now, in order to understand that, because it sounds like a strange concept, so you're partially free and that's an amazing thing. Why? Well, think about the gifts to the Kohanim. You're giving a partial amount of your assets to the Kohen. How's that amazing? Let's ask a simple question about the gifts to the Kohanim, or similarly, the gifts to the Leviim. The gifts, the 24 different gifts that a Jew gives to the Kohen, all comprise fractions of a person's income, of a person's possessions. I'm giving a little bit, right? Even things like truma, chala, die Sachen, was man darf geben, dem Kohen, which you have to first give the portion to the Kohen before you could have anything for yourself. What does Hashir? There's a limit. Sadav zayin reishis. It's the beginning of what you give, not all of your produce. And even when the Rabbanan gave very specific amounts of what constitutes truma and what constitutes challah, they're small amounts. But you don't give away all your produce as truma. And actually, the halacha is that the amount you retain for yourself has to be substantial and noticeable. Meiser likewise, it's only 10%. So this doesn't seem to make sense. If the whole response to Korach is, no, there's no separation between the Kohen and their spiritual reality and me and my mundane reality, because I can elevate my mundane reality to be holy, well, then why am I only elevating a piece of it? The fact that you want to say there's a minimum amount in order to qualify for Truma, that makes sense. As is move on. You tell me I can't give less than a certain amount, great, fine, we get it, we accept it. But why is there a ceiling? Why is there a cap on how much you can give? Why do we have a rule that says you may not give everything away? In fact, certain of the things that we give, not only are we not allowed to give all of our assets, we're not allowed to give more than the amount that the Torah has determined. Because the Rambam paskend, to the extent the Rambam tells us in the halachas of all of these gifts, a person should never designate all of his possessions to Hashem. And if you do, that would be a transgression of what the Torah says. As we famously know, he tells us that if a person is going to be magnanimous in their gifts to the Kohanim, the Leviim, etc., don't give more than 20% of your total. Why not? Isn't the whole objective to elevate the mundane so that we can prove Korach wrong, so that we can show that there's no breakdown between those people who live in the higher, holy reality are totally disconnected from... No, they're not disconnected. The people in the ordinary reality can also elevate their life. So why only a small piece? So to understand that, let's understand the difference between a Kohen, that's who Korach is fighting, and a Levi, which is Korach's reality. Chassidus explains the fundamental difference between the world of Kohanim and the world of Leviim. As a Kohen is in Yonah Ish HaChesed, a Kohen is fundamentally an individual of Chesed, which is all about giving, but it's all about flowing from the have to the have-not, from the higher to the lower. And in Yonim Shel Leviim is Gevura, whereas Leviim are all about Gevura, which is about focus and intention and working your way upwards, climbing to a higher space. On Korach was given a Levi, so Korach comes from the world of Leviim, the world of Gevura. So the fact that he is challenging the Kohen means that he wants to overwhelm the world of Chesed with the world of Gevura, which means that Leviim should replace the Kohanim as the spiritual leaders. What does that actually mean? In Avodas Adam is the chilek between Chesed and Gevura, so we can apply this in really practical terms in our lives. What is the difference between serving Hashem through the Chesed channel, serving Hashem through the Gevura channel? Chesed is in Yonei Ashpo Milmayla Lamata Shoiv in Welt. The whole process of Chesed is bringing from the higher realms into the lower realms, inspiring, influencing, sharing, giving, etc. That's what we call Shoiv, bringing the energy into our reality. Whereas Gevura is all about lifting the individual or lifting the reality to become closer to Hashem. And that is what we call Rotzoi, yearning, Aroizgen from Welt, trying to transcend the shackles of the world that you live in. So a Kohen is typically a Chesed person, let's bring abundance and share and inspire. And a Levi is typically a Gevura person, let's lift ourselves so we can reach something that's higher than ourselves. Und der Sherish von Tanis Korach is given, as the Iker soll sein, den HaGevura, der Avodah von Rotzev Aliyah. What does Korach want? That the focus of Judaism should be pushing people to transcend themselves and to connect to something which is higher than themselves. Not like we have it now with the Kohanim or Tisnasu, they're just like helping us along and inspiring us. No, work harder. Korach hat gehalten, as Tachtene Wiese seinen in Seir Metzies. And the reason for Korach's argument is because fundamentally Korach believes this. The world as it is, in its default state, seinen it can cannot absorb, accommodate, or appreciate holy, godly things. So the only way to help the world is let it break out of itself and move higher. Our raise came from the Maimon, the Matzah, from Maton, Eila Zayin Chelek. Transcend yourself. It's your only hope. You are not cut out to absorb and experience godliness. Your only chance is break out of yourself. By the way, this does not contradict what we've mentioned both here and elsewhere. As the Machlekes von Korach is given, if dem was die Kehanim befragt kein Godel, rufen areis bei alle Iden, die nur von aufheben sich durch sehr avoide lamate in Welt. 1 second. What was Korach's argument? You're an aloof personality. You're going to influence the Jewish person, and that's going to influence the Jewish person to also want to become a little bit spiritually aloof. Because Korach still had a problem. Korach says, I know you're also, as a Kohen, influencing, inspiring, moving people to grow, but you're doing it in a chesed way. You're showering the person with insight and with influence and with inspiration. But the person's still the person. So Korach is saying, as long as we've got Kohanim in those spiritual leadership positions, they're not challenging the people to break out of themselves. All you're doing is you're shifting the person to be able to experience and absorb and relate to godliness. And that would be similar to the concept of you still do your thing, but you do it for the sake of heaven. So Korach doesn't want that. Korach wants a challenge to the people that's going to push the people to completely transcend themselves. Is the Abschlag und Tikkun of Machlekes Korach nicht durch Karbonos v'Kotshim. So the response to Korach is not going to be to say, let's bring Karbonos and give some of those Karbonos to the Kohanim, because that would imply that the only way to connect is you've got to completely transcend yourself. You've got to completely give to Hashem. You've got to sacrifice it on an altar. The specific way to respond to Korach's rebellion is to say, you've got to give gifts of what you have to the Kohanim, rather than consume everything you have in Hashem's world. And we'll understand exactly in a moment what that means, and how actually there are 3 possibilities of how to connect ourselves and our world to Hashem, and the 3 possibilities help us really to respond to and to negate Korach's approach. In Akravas HaKorbanos, when it comes to bringing a korban, or bechlolos the inim from kochim, that's bringing a korban specifically, and generally anything that falls into the realm of the sanctified elements of either animals sacrificed or items donated to the Beis HaMikdash. Vasa'id is makdish zayin nechosim la'avaya, where a person donates their assets to Hashem. If I take an animal and I make it a korban to Hashem, I'm not making a clear statement that an animal can accommodate godliness or channel godliness. Because it's no longer an ordinary animal. It's reclassified as something which is completely different. This animal is no longer tethered to a human. It doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to the holy world. It's kachim. So I've transformed the physical thing and then made it into a korban. But when I give the gifts to the kohanim, so that's where a person has certain belongings, certain possessions, of which the person gives a portion to the kohen. Und der kohen estes. So let's say it's truma, for example. I give it to the kohen eats it. It's parts of the korban shlamim. I give it to the kohen eats it. And we're told that the way the kohen eats it is in a lavish way. He eats it almost like royalty, the halacha is. So I'm allowing the kohen to experience some personal benefit and enjoyment out of this donation to something holy. It's not like putting it on the mizbech and it's completely consumed in a godly fire. In fact, some of the gifts to the kohen happen outside of Israel as well, and they are completely mundane. They have no holiness attached to them. Dafkin dem is nicht mudgesh as ich matzov fun in yonim dilemata as chulin sein is a shaykh tzelikus. I'm making a massive statement which flies in the face of everything Korach believes. Korach says the only way to fix, help, or elevate the world is you got to break it out of its existing framework so that it becomes something different and holy, and then it connects to Hashem. Well, the Matnos Kahuna don't do that. They remain ordinary things, just dedicated to and used by a Kohen, and that allows them connection to Hashem, teaching me it is possible to connect the world and its possessions to godliness without fundamentally breaking the world and turning it into something else. But even that's not the ultimate. Aber euch bei Matnes Kahuna is noch nicht mutgisch betachlis u beschleimes as euch dvorim tachtonim. Even the gifts to the Kohen isn't yet the ultimate expression of how really mundane, lowly things, in their mundane, lowly state, are completely connected to Hashem. Why not? Warum? For two reasons. Aleph, the majority of the gifts given to the Kohanim, which is the Eser B'Mikdash, the 10 that have to be consumed in the Beis HaMikdash, V'Arba B'Yerushalayim, and 4 that have to be consumed in the walls of Yerushalayim. The way they work is, Vern Frier Kadosh, first they are designated as holy, and then you hand them to the Kohen. So let's say, for example, it's the parts of a korban that you eat. The korban is first holy, and then part of the korban is given to the Kohen to eat. And the Kohanim is mishulchan govoya kozochu, as the expression goes in the Gemara, that the Kohanim are considered to be eating off Hashem's table. Let's use other examples that are not limited specifically to Yerushalayim, like the truma from grain, or the bikurim from fruit, or challah from dough. You have to separate them, designate them as something which is for Hashem, and then you give it to the Kohen. The pasuk is madgish, but Parashah saying there's a few psukim that indicate this. The first fruits that are given to Hashem, you hand over to the Kohanim. Same principle, right? The first fruits that are in your land, you bring them to Hashem, give them to the Kohen. Titnu Hashem truma b'achala, that you give it to Hashem and then as a donation to the Kohen. And even in this unique scenario of somebody who stole something from a convert, the convert dies, has no heirs. Who gets the reparations? The Kohanim. Guess what? Even there, the halacha is that technically it first belongs to Hashem, it becomes holy, and then it's given to the Kohen. So if we're trying to prove to Korach that you can take the physical world as it is a physical world and connect it to Hashem, the Matnos Kahuna don't really seem to tell us that message, because the Matnos Kahuna, we take something physical, break it out of its physical reality, which is what Korach wants, turn it into something holy so it transcends itself, which is what Korach wants, and then we give it to the Kohen. And and even the other 10 types of offerings which we give to the Kohen anywhere and everywhere, these are things that even when they're in my possession, technically don't belong to me. They actually belong to the Kohen. For example, matnos royo lechayim v'kevos, de'achuzos, de'charomim, various parts of the animal that we're supposed to give, and a field that a person designates as a donation to Hashem, etc. That's no longer mine; it belongs to the Kohen. By the way, was matnos matonos and ste'achuz are not the mefarish b'parasha. Saying the truth is that these categories are actually not even mentioned in our parasha, so they're not even really a response to Korach's rebellion. They actually relate to Parashat Pinchas, which is coming later. So because the Matnos Kahuna don't yet disprove Korach's outlook, because we are actually first elevating or transforming something and then handing it to the Kohen, which doesn't speak the message of take the physical world as it is and connect it to God. In the parasha, therefore we extend the message and the theme into another class of gifts that will illustrate the answer to Korach's rebellion even better, and that is Meiser. Why Meiser? For two reasons. Was Aleph, even after you have separated and handed the Meiser to the Levi, it does not have the status of being holy. It has a status of being mundane. It has absolutely zero holiness, as the Rambam tells us, and a non-Levi would be entitled to eat it. Number 2, base, says until I separate Meiser, there is no part of my produce that is pre-designated as Meiser. There's a part of my produce that is pre-designated as Truma. In other words, there's a certain portion of my produce that doesn't belong to me, it belongs to the Kohen. That is not the case for a Levi. So Meiser is something which is much more tethered in the physical, mundane world. And it could still create a connection to Hashem and become something which is elevated without having to break out of its shell. That's a response to Korach. That illustrates that something which is completely mundane, tachtonim mamash, it is literally still part of this lowly world, can be absolutely connected to Hashem. How is it connected to Hashem? By us designating and handing it over to a Levi, who is somebody who lives, so to speak, with his portion being Hashem. That's an answer to Korach. Korach, you believe that the only way to elevate the world is it's got to totally lose all its mundane nature. That's not true. Look at Meiser. You can have mundane things that are completely connected to Hashem. Now, to better understand everything about Korach's argument and how we talk to this message of being able to elevate the world without completely smashing the world as Korach wanted, let's look at something else that Korach said, as the Medrash famously tells us, in his argument against Moshe and Aaron. One of the first salvos in the war against Kahuna that Korach launched was Talis Shekula Techeles. If I have a garment that is completely dyed with the blue tcheles, surely it does no longer require the strings of tzitzis, because the purpose of the strings of tzitzis surely is just to have the one strand that is tcheles. Here the whole talis is tcheles. What was he on about? His Mevorah Tainos in Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe explains, the inyan von talis levush shekula tcheles weiß lefichinas makif. A talis is something that you wrap around yourself, even the way we put it on, right? And in order for a talis to fulfill the role of a talis, it's got to be big enough that you could wrap it around yourself. Therefore, it represents the kind of energy or divine light which is called makif, something that completely encompasses us, a very intense, very powerful kind of divine energy that we can't absorb, so it can only encompass us. Und ein Inyan von Makif darf in dem nicht sein kein Tzitzis. Was ziehen sich von dem Amshach bepnimius. When you've got such a powerful, dynamic energy around, doesn't make sense to have tzitzis, which represent very specific and limited streams of energy. So that's what Korach is saying. If you've got so much overwhelming godliness, why do you need these little details? Und der Mitt hat gewollt herausbringen, auf Kahunas Aaron, wie es ist Mevorah Chassidus Barucha, and that was really what Korach was fighting against in the deepest level, against the Kahuna, because he's saying, what do we need this for? You've got Aaron, as the Pasuk in Tehillim tells us, the beard of Aaron is the representation of this flow of intense divine energy into strands that can kind of relate to the community. And Korach saying, I come from the world of Levim, we cut off all those strands, we shave ourselves from top to toe, because if you've got such an intense connection to Makif energy, why on earth would you want to limit it and filter it down into these unique streams? And that translates into something that applies to us on a personal level. In Avodas Hashem Bedakos Meintesoich, this is something in a much more subtle way that could relate to our service of Hashem. Let's say that the only reason a person becomes more refined or elevated or transformed is why? Because of exposure. Great divine energy, inspiration, light, overwhelmingly so. Not as a result of my personal efforts and developing myself from the bottom up. So of course, if there's divine revelation, we will be completely consumed and one with Hashem, like for example at Har Sinai. Is das the Gabe from Makif? As much as would be completely enveloped by the experience, that's exactly the problem. It would be something that envelops us. It wouldn't be personal and relatable to us. I don't play a role. I don't relate. I'm not part of this. I'm completely left out. I'm just swept up in the euphoria of the divine revelation. And that's actually not good enough, because we're supposed to be part of the experience. We're supposed to completely resonate with the godly experience. Aber Pisea Shlomo as Bedakus is euch der Ihnen von Meiser noch nicht in ganzem Aspekt als Tikkun auf Machlokes Korach, which actually, now when we're really looking at things subtly, tells us that even Meiser, although Meiser illustrates that ordinary, mundane things can have a meaningful, absolute relationship with Hashem, still not a full answer to Korach's complaints or arguments. Now, put Matnos Kahuna and Meiser together, see the common thread between them, and that will teach us that there's another layer of what they achieve in terms of bringing godliness into the world or lifting the world to connect to godliness. Sie seine Madgish und bringen heraus, wenn dem übrigen tell Nechosim, was bleiben bei dem Eden, because Matnos Kahuna and Meiser don't only tell the story of the portion we donate and designate, they actually tell the story also of the portion that is left behind, which goes back to our earlier question, why are we only giving part of our things away? That's why, because the part we give away tells the story of the part we retain. When I'm looking at the actual portion that I'm giving the Kohen or the Levi, why do we give these things away? Because Hashem told us to. Milamaila, makif. It's what the Eibusher did for us, told us, instructed us. Therefore, that's not yet the ultimate expression of that doesn't yet tell the story of the physical world in its physical, finite reality. Becomes a vessel or conduit for godliness, because it's not the normal world. This is the part of the world that Hashem has instructed about, that Hashem has given us rules that we need to follow. As we know, the Chazal tell us about tzedakah, as noch in Sivef Meisters is a chelek for Mammon and Chosim, was Minachatchile gehört das nicht zu ihm. Once the Eibusher tells you you have to give these portions, they actually don't belong to you. They've just been entrusted to you. So giving Meiser is not something to pat ourselves on the back and say, wow, I'm amazing, I gave Meiser. No, I returned the part that the Eibusher had apportioned for me to give to the Levi. So that's not yet teaching us that you take the world as the world is and connect it to godliness. So what do the gifts to the Kohanim and the Levim highlight? As Chotch, die übergebliebene Gehalt zum Menschen. I've given away my 10% or whatever it amounts to when you add up all the various gifts. And now I've got the remainder. And that remainder is for me to use for my things. Zu benutzen sich mit sei. I've got to feed my family, put a roof over my head, buy clothing, etc. Is es der Fall, weil der Eibusher hat sie zugeteilt. Now is where the key attitude switch happens. I have all of the stuff because Hashem gave it to me. Und der Verguffer werden sie durch Mathe ausgenutzt, so wie der Eibusher will. And therefore, it's not my independent wealth. This is the gift Hashem gave to me, the amount that I'm keeping for myself, and therefore I'm going to use it in a way that is aligned with what the Eibusher wants, not just simply as I want. Doch dem darf es egal, also ich dvorim gashmim mamish, wie sie bleiben in ganzen Rechush von Menschen. In this way I can highlight that even real physical things in the realm and scope of the human asset is in the beginning von Tachtonim, in the lowest of the low, when Beprimius in ganzen verbunden mit Elikus is actually truly completely connected to Hashem in an ofen von Bechol Derochecha Do'ehu, which means practically that as I go through life, eating, drinking, experiencing whatever I spend my money on, it will be with an awareness of the Eibusher and to serve the Eibusher. And that is how you create the ultimate home for Hashem in the lower realm. Not by lifting things out of the lower realm as karbonos and then they become holy, or even as the matnos kahuna and then they become holy. Not even like Maisa, which is designated, and then it is, although mundane, still connected to godliness. This is mine, and it's still connected to godliness. It's in my world with my limitations, and still connected to Hashem. Shlomo der Chefsher, as das Guf is the time was Saiba matnos kahuna. Saiba Maisa is Dashir Kotzev. That would explain why there's a quota of how much you have to give for Truma and Meiser. Und ein Mensch Torah nicht abwegeben seine ganzen Nechosim, and you're not allowed to exceed that quota. Warum die Verbundenheit mit der Kurs in die Nechosim ist in einem anderen Öfen wie in die, was darf weggeben. Because they wants us to know that there's a connection between the assets we retain that is different to the connection with the assets that we give away. That's why the Torah is so concerned that we shouldn't impoverish ourselves, so that we can have things we could still use to elevate and connect to Hashem. So we have three things over here. We have Matnos Kahuna, that's already holy, Meiser, which is mundane but designated, and our own things, which we keep and still connect to Hashem. I mean, for Dugma zu die drei Inyonim hanal kotche mamish, roi vika matis kahuna und meiser, und in the Chosavs bleiben by dimensions, so the three categories, we've got the things that are completely holy, mundane things given to a Levi, and things we retain for ourselves. So these are represented in a certain way in Madregas and Achdas Hashem, in three different ways that we could speak about the oneness of Hashem. Category one is where you elevate the world to an extent of complete oneness with Hashem. Or alternatively, the second possibility is you bring the oneness of Hashem into the reality of the world. And then the ultimate state, which is Yichud, Yichud Ilava, Yichud Tato, you completely synthesize the higher reality where there's only Hashem with the lower reality that says Hashem is the one who creates everything. What does that mean? So the from is, let's look at category number one. Hashem is one. Why? Because we lift the world to a state of awareness of Hashem is one. Kind of Korach's attitude, or the matnos kahuna, the korbanos. You take something, schlep it out of the world, and it becomes part of Hashem's oneness. That would represent the understanding that even after the world has been created and everything appears to have its own independence, actually, there is no such thing as independence. Actually, everything is completely bottled to Hashem. That would highlight the fact that we and all of the things in our world are not real. They don't actually have substance. And the only reality of our world is its spiritual point of origin in the world of Atzilus. So lift up the world to acknowledge its true self, and then it will know that everything is one with Hashem. When you look at the world through this lens, you pull back from the world. I don't want to have to be dragged down into the world. And this really plays out in the way that a tzaddik lives and the way that a tzaddik serves Hashem, which is like Korach once, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Shammai, living in this absolute spiritual orbit that does not require engagement with the world. Then there's the Tzveit Ofen von Havaya Echad. There's another way that we experience and express Hashem's oneness, and that's by bringing that awareness down into the consciousness of this world. That's where godliness expresses itself in every single piece of existence. There is a world. It actually exists. Hashem created it for real. But what we do is we illustrate that the world's existence is godliness pulsating beneath the surface that you just don't notice. But that's actually what it is. So when we look at the world through that lens, it stimulates us not to run from the world, on the contrary, to engage the world because it's got godliness in it. I can actually benefit and enjoy the world, except of course it's a consciousness, it's a benefit and enjoyment of godliness. Of course, this is a step beyond the previous yichud, which basically says negate the world in order to connect to Hashem. This is saying connect with Hashem within the world. Still, the person is very conscious of the fact that there is a world and there's godliness. They are different but connected. What's the ultimate state? So the Yichud von Yichudu Ilav Yichud HaTato is nirgash wie die Metzias HaGashmi und sein Asivano verna Inyan von Elikos. The ultimate state is the synthesis of the higher reality and the lower consciousness, which means I don't see a distinction. I don't see a world connected to God. I don't see a world with godliness pulsating within it. I see that the world is Elikos. Or as the Rebbe says elsewhere, the Yesh HaNivra is one with the Yesh HaAmiti. That the created existence is actually one and the same as the truest existence. That's the ultimate state. That's saying the stuff I don't give to the Kohen and the Levi is absolutely holy. Let's link that back to Gimel Tammuz. When Gimel Tammuz dafka to Parshas Korach, and why it's specifically Gimel, not Yud Beis or Yud Tammuz, that is connected to Korach. Yud Beis v'Yud Gimel Tammuz, when we reach the end of the story, when the Frierdiker Rebbe is released from prison on Yud Beis and Gimel Tammuz, v'matem Rebbe in ganzen befreit, Euch von Golos Kastrama, where he's even released from the house arrest / exile. Drückt sich nicht aus beschleimes wie die Arbeit von Abbot Zater, weil ja, das hat gepellt, euch auf die Tachtonim, was haben ihm arrestiert. At that moment, you don't see clearly that the Frierdiker Rebbe's efforts in spreading Torah actually impacted and transformed those forces of opposition who wanted him arrested and imprisoned. Which is a fascinating thought, right? We're not seeing in that story that they are supportive of what the Frierdiker Rebbe is doing. Why not? What you're seeing is the Frierdiker Rebbe escapes them. He's out of their jurisdiction. Even though they don't disappear and they still have anti-Jewish laws, etc. But Dafka b'Gimel Tammuz, what happens on Gimel Tammuz is even more fascinating. They chose to send the Frierdiker Rebbe to Kastrama. And going to Kastrama, before the Frierdiker Rebbe even gets there, what does he do? The Frierdiker Rebbe pre-arranges bringing children to start a school, fixing the mikveh that's there, and then the Frierdiker Rebbe arrives and teaches Chassidus. That's in their space, in their penal colony. He's doing all the things that they told him not to do. That is the moment in the story that illustrates the lowest, most corrupted part of the world, still locked into their physical lowliness. They still have the Rebbe in their penal colony. Are allowing the Frierdiker Rebbe to do what he does. That's that is very similar to what completely neutralized Korach's arguments. What was the response to Korach's arguments? That ordinary mundane things, while they are still in their lowly state, they don't have to become Meiser to become holy. They don't have to be given as Matnos Kahuna or a Korban before they have a holy value. As they are holy. Same theme as Gimel Tammuz. As the Frierdiker Rebbe is in the Russian compound, in Kastrama, he's doing his avodah. With that in mind, you could say, there are now 3 steps of the dismantling of Korach's argument. First, explaining that there's such a thing as a korban, that the physical world can connect to Hashem, but it's first got to be holy. Then the next level, even if it's not holy, and it feels like they're two separate in Yonim, one is mundane and one is godliness, and you connect them like in Meiser. And then the ultimate, that the physical, as it is physical, has the opportunity and should be used and will be used to serve Hashem. Seine Bechlolus merumes eichen der Torah, was der Rebbe hat gesagt, is geendig von Tfisse fahren abfahren in Kastrama. That's something alluded to in what the Frierdiker Rebbe said in a very brief Torah that he shared when he was about to leave for Kastrama. What did he say? He said as follows: When beten by Hashem Yisborach, we asked the Eibishter, that the Eibishter should be with us as he was with our forebearers, and he shouldn't abandon us. And then he explained, Hashem Yisborach soll sein mit uns, wird sein mit uns, he said it means that the Eibishter should and definitely will be with us as he was with our forefathers. Even though we're not of the caliber of our forefathers. Because they were people who literally sacrificed their lives and their souls for Torah. It seems a bit strange. A few questions about this. We have to ask a few questions. Aleph, in the actual expression of what we're asking Hashem. That the Eibishter should be with us. If you want to say Havaya should be with us, Havaya is completely transcendence. Past, present, and future all rolled into one. It's completely supernatural. That's godliness which is beyond relating to the realities of the world. Darf man noch der Mosef sein und mit dir sein Azeres Imonu. Then you have to qualify and say the greatness that we're asking for is that Havaya, which doesn't belong in our realm, should be Imonu, should be with us. Mashenket Shem Elikim, was sein Teich is Azeres Takif Amitz Asher Lo Yachilas Milyonim V'Tachtonim, like the Shulchan Aruch says, that Elikim means that Eibush is all powerful and controls everything in the higher and lower realms. And we're not just saying Elikim, we're saying Elokei Nu, our Elikim. It's doch der Pirush as Eibush is Koichenu V'Chayusenu, which emphasizes that Eibush is our strength and our life. Weiß es doch as Eibush is mit uns, that obviously indicates that Eibush is with us. It's the Chayre nit nötig zu Mosef sein dem Wort Imonu. So why add the word Imonu? By saying Elokeinu, you're already saying that Eibush is with us. Why say Elokeinu Imonu? Or could have just simply said, let Havaya be with us. That's question 1. Question 2, you're already saying let Eibush be with us. Now you have to say something which is kind of a little bit of a lower request. Don't abandon us. And the last question is, how does a Friedrich Rebbe say we don't have Mesiras Nefesh? Why is he going to prison? Gimel, der Rebbe hat gesagt, Hagam seinen doch nicht gleich zu sein, welche seinen gewinn bei Mesiras Nefesh befehl mamish of Torah mitzvahs. He says, we're not like our forefathers who had this tremendous Mesiras Nefesh of Torah mitzvahs. Beim Rebbe ist doch in jener Zmanim gewinn den von Mesiras Nefesh befehl. That's exactly what the Friedrich Rebbe was living through at that time. Absolute Mesiras Nefesh for Torah mitzvahs. Und viele sitzen sich in Tfisa he went to prison. Even after he went to prison, he still had Mesiras Nefesh. His Afilm is also sagen, als mit der Nove von Rebben hat gehalten als ein Mesiras Nefesh ist nicht gleich zu dem Mesiras Nefesh von Aviseinu. Even if you want to stretch the point and say, well, the Friedrich Rebbe, in his great humility, felt that his Mesiras Nefesh was not of the caliber of his forebears. Hat aber doch nicht gedacht, das sagen in einer Loschen. He didn't have to say it in this way. Hagam, mir seien doch nicht gleich zu Aviseinu, welche seinen gewähren bei Mesiras Nefesh per Mamish. Was a shell in ganzen dem Mesiras Nefesh bepel mamish makes it sound like he's not having Mesiras Nefesh. They had Mesiras Nefesh. I don't. Why are you saying that? It's the beer in there, and the explanation is the Friedrich Rebbe is not only talking about himself over here, and he's not only talking about a single experience of dedication to Hashem. The Rebbe had gewollt peil sein dem inyan. The Friedrich Rebbe wanted to achieve inyan ageula by alle Eden, that it wouldn't just be a personal emancipation from an experience of prison, but it would be a broader geula for everybody. As the Friedrich Rebbe writes in that letter, where he says that this was a time of celebration and redemption, even for the person who's only Jewish in name. Und der Rebbe hat gebracht, that's why the Friedrich Rebbe quoted this pasuk and then said, even though we're not like our forefathers. Das heißt, he wasn't talking about himself. He's talking about those other Jewish people who are not like their forefathers. They don't have the resilience to sacrifice their lives for their Yiddishkeit. He's asking and davening that the Eibusha should be with those Yidden like the Eibusha was with their forefathers who perhaps deserved it more. As the Rebbe had gewollt auftan die Geula euch bei die, was seine no b'shem Yisrael Yechune. Now that we understand what's the Friedrich Rebbe's objective over here, to bring about Geula even for the Jew who is so detached that he's only Jewish in name, without considering how observant or not they may be. With that in mind, we can say, as mit der Hisofa agam seinen doch nicht gleich zu Aviseinu. By the Friedrich Rebbe making that point, we might not be as great as our forefathers. Hat der Rebbe gemeint, merame sein zum Pirush HaMedrash. The Friedrich Rebbe was alluding to the Medrash on that pasuk. The Medrash says something fascinating. Shlomo Melech says to the Eibishter, Melech shu tzreicha poelem, ben oisem melach miyav, ben oisem schoran. If a king hires servants, and they do an excellent job of what he expects from him, and therefore he pays them, mashevach yesh lo melech. That's not nobody's impressed by that. That's what everybody does. When is the Eibishter praiseworthy, or the king in this case praiseworthy? When he hires workers who are not great workers. They don't do what they're supposed to. And in his benevolence he still rewards them. That's a tremendous accolade for that king. Look how compassionate he is. That says the Medrash is the meaning of this pasuk, that the Eibishter should be with us even though we don't deserve it, because that's the Eibishter's greatness. So the Friedrich Rebbe wants to invoke that and bring about the capacity to even free and release those who are the so-called bad workers. And therefore we could say the Friedrich Rebbe was identifying 3 different levels of connection to Hashem. And they align with the 3 different levels of Karbonos / Matnos Kahuna, Meiser, and the possessions we keep for ourselves, or the Yichud of Elikus by breaking the world out of its Metzios, the Yichud of Elikus by bringing awareness of Elikus into the world, or absolute synthesis of even the lowest of the low with godliness. Aleph, level number 1. Havaya v'eret Elokeinu as the Eibush is kochenu v'chayu. The first level is Havaya is our koyach. Was das weiß, als die ganze Metzius von der Menschen ist und sein koyach v'chayis begolis Elikus. That is somebody like the tzaddik who knows consciously that everything about me, all of my power, all of my life, that's godliness. Beis, the next level, the person not necessarily a tzaddik. Havaya Elokeinu imonu. The Eibush is with us. There's us, and there's an Eibush who's with us. The Mensch is via Zach Farzech. I am an independent human being. Now the Eibush is mit him, but the Eibush is with me. Aber das Guf, was Elokeinu is imonu, is a raya as verbunden mit Elikus. The fact that Elokeinu is with us, then implies that there is a connection. It's like giving the meiser. It's a physical, mundane thing that is designated for a holy purpose. But the ultimate level actually is not to abandon us. To reach the point that Elikus touches the Jew who is completely detached, only Jewish in name. You look at these people, you can't see the connection. You don't see that they're godly. You don't see that they're Jewish. To reach a point that even they experience Geula. The Friedrich Rebbe created a catch-all for them by saying, the will be with us even if we're not like our forefathers. If in Pirush HaMedrash Canal, to invoke that Medrash we looked at with the king who's so compassionate that he gives reward even to the people who don't do what they're supposed to. Und der Mitot der aufgetan, als ich bei die Payal im Roim, soll sein al kolponim der Hergesh von al Azveni val Yechenu. So what the Friedrich Rebbe achieves in that is that even the people who are completely so-called the bad workers, who are not dedicated to what they're supposed to be doing, maybe they don't feel Yehav Elokeinu imanu, but al Azveni val Yechenu, they don't feel abandoned or detached or separated. Also wie sie seien in dem Matze soll sich ansehen, als sie seine Chassidus mit abgesundet und verlassen von Eibishten, that they should be conscious of the fact we're not abandoned, we're not separate, we're not cut off from the Eibishter. Und in dem Daf gedrückt sich aus, wie sei ich selche. And that highlights that even those people, was seinem Tachtonim is Metzias Aniris Vaniglis, that outwardly appear to be the lowest, seinen Shaykh Tzedekos are completely connected to the Eibishter. Doesn't matter what level a Jew happens to be at. Is ein Emesse und pnimistische Metzias Elikus. The truth of that yid is Elikus. Not only the Jew who has dedicated himself, like when we dedicate things to the Kohanim and the Leviim, but even the stuff we keep for ourselves. The Jew who lives for himself. Of Eloshim von Rebbe, again to borrow language from the Friedrich Rebbe, Kol Ish Yisrael, every single Jew, regardless of his level of observance or lack thereof, his heart is sincerely dedicated to Hashem and the Torah. And that kind of insight and perspective on the so-called lowest Jew has an impact on the lowest parts of the world itself. In this case, the very powerful opposition to Elikus. Even those people who arrested the Friedrich Rebbe and wanted the worst things. Without them doing tshuva and elevating themselves and breaking out as Korach would have wanted from them. As they are, they endorsed the Rebbe's work. Until eventually they actually assisted in freeing him. So we know that the whole purpose of commemorating historical events in Torah is so that they should reoccur. That means that every one of us, the Eibusha should be with us, not with them, not another generation or a great group of people, but us. That means we're all empowered, and we all have the Eronis in Kech from Gimel Tammuz. We have the lesson and the empowerment of Gimel Tammuz. We should not be in any way worried or overwhelmed by what appear to be the obstacles to spreading and sharing Torah and Chassidus. And not only do we have an insight, but we have a promise. As the Friedrich Rebbe said, the Eibusha should be and Vetzan will be with us. There's a promise in that. The Eibusha will be with us. The Eibusha will not chas from abandon us. And therefore, to borrow again the language that the Friedrich Rebbe used in the Sikha on Gimel Tammuz, that every single Jewish person should experience light both in a spiritual and in a material way. Kein tiye lanu.